For those that I haven't met before, it's great to meet you. Buongiorno. My name is Chris Wahl. I work at Rubrik as the Chief Technologist, but for this particular session, I'd like to share the fact that I have a blog at wahlnetwork.com, and you can catch my podcast every week on Wednesdays, very late on Wednesdays for you, and a little early in the morning back in the U.S., called Datanauts. And the focus of that podcast is on kind of the broken pieces of enterprise IT, some of the new things we're doing in the data center and cloud space. And really, it's just me and my friend Ethan, talking nerdy about engineering and architecture. So tune in if you want, and I'll show you how to get some stickers before we leave here today. So that's a little bit about me, right? And so one thing I want to talk about today, and the drive behind this open source project that's been going on for a couple of years that I want to make you aware of and invite you to be part of, is this intent to migrate your skills from being someone who's imperative in the world of IT, meaning you're clicking the buttons and pulling the levers and telling systems what to do, versus being declarative. And sometimes that's called infrastructure as code, right? And I think that's kind of become a little bit buzzwordy, but realistically it's just trying to control a system using a configuration rather than what you have in your head to tell the system what to do. I like to liken it to the pancake versus waffle debate. It's a very serious debate. I don't think it'll ever be completely resolved. I'm definitely in the waffle camp because it's a very highly designed piece of food because it has little pockets for the syrup, and I think that's important. With the pancake, it just slides off. So if you're in the pancake camp, I call that the imperative folks versus the declarative. But more seriously, it's really just an admission that this particular piece in IT is changing quite a bit, right? And that the folks that are in the world of IT that are moving towards declarative type skills, where they understand a broad set of systems and fabrics and cloud platforms and things like that, have more are more desirable in the market, and frankly get to have a little bit more fun, I think. Because for a very long time, I was a developer. Back in the 90s, I wrote COBOL and Fortran, if you remember those languages. And then the Y2K bug hit, where basically the date field was only 2 digits instead of 4. And I was very imperative back then. I was just going around and fixing that. And then I saw a movie that kind of changed my mind. So really, it's just, are you building by hand, or are you working with intelligent systems that can take what you want to build and turn that into the end result for the system, kind of the waffle. My advice, be the waffle. Even if you have to be imperative right now and build systems by hand and have a very deep knowledge of storage systems or network or even virtualization, even just purely knowing VMware, it's a great time to start learning other technologies and how to automate them and how to stitch them together so that they work together in a declarative manner. So that's something I've been talking about since about 2013, when everyone thought I was crazy. And now maybe I'm a little less crazy, although I'm still a little bit. The problem that I found in the VMware world was that there wasn't a really good way to be declarative when it came to vSphere, right? A lot of the tools out there, such as configuration management from Chef and Puppet, and Ansible, and SaltStack, and all those kind of tools were really, really focused on applications and what goes inside of a virtual machine. But there wasn't a lot focused on the vSphere environment itself, right? So how are the hosts configured, and how are the virtual machines at a configuration level detailed? How is the network put together, the switches, and everything that constitutes a vSphere environment outside of the basics that are inside the virtual machines themselves, right? There's a couple open source projects. The PyVMomi particular Python flavor had some ideas there. Puppet had an open source module that hadn't been updated in years, and when I pinged the VMware people about it, they had no intent of really going down that path. And the thing that really made me kind of disappointed was I was at a VCDX kind of lunch and learn thing at VMWorld, and there was an admission that there wasn't a lot of people using the API, and therefore there wasn't a lot of investment prior to today into the API. And that's something that I think Alan Renouf and his team are fixing, but it's just an admission that we really haven't focused on how to do things declarative. So the quiz that I came up with, and the problem that I had over the years was, are you a VMware administrator? Probably, I would hope so. But to be able to answer all of these questions about the environment was tough. Do you know that NTP and DNS and all of the configurations for the host level are the same without relying on host profiles, which I'm not a huge fan of those anyways, right? Do you know these things are true? Now, you might have set them by hand and maybe think that no one's gone in there and changed them, but also you got to remember you're your own worst enemy. And sometimes at 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning, you're going in and you're making changes because you're troubleshooting or fighting a fire or trying to fix something. And that's your worst self because you're tired, you make some changes, you forget about them, or you're trying something out and you don't remember what the original settings were. So being able to not only know these things are true, but to make sure they continue to be true is something that I think we'd all like to know. Wouldn't you like to know for sure that these things are true and collaborate on them with your team, right? Even if you're your own team, someday I think you plan to maybe get a different job or take a holiday. That's usually a good thing to do. So wouldn't it be great to know these things are going to be true even when you're not there? And that really was the birth of a project called vSphere, which I found out recently. I think that's Dutch for like vest, like you wear a vest, or Norwegian. I forget what. I've been in so many countries recently. I can't remember where I was at, but they were chuckling. I had to ask them what's the joke. And so vSphere is a project that's open source. It requires no licensing, no money, no special technology, right? You can just use it today. Even if you're a consultant and you want to use it in someone else's environment, great. It's very, very lightweight. There's no installation required other than a little bit of PowerShell. Right? There's no real knowledge required. We've abstracted all that away so that you can be kind of an IT generalist and use it. And not only can it report on your environment, which I think there's tools that can do that and tell you kind of what's broken and things like that, it can fix it. And it can fix it in an automated fashion. Right? Does that sound interesting so far? Is that what you signed up for? Did you not get enough coffee a little bit earlier? I'm kind of worried. Got a quiet crowd. All right, well, we'll keep plunging. This is a quote from a guy named Brian Bunky, and he came to me a little over a year and a half ago when my project wasn't even called vSphere yet or barely called vSphere. It was something that I wrote for my home lab, which I spent way too much money on, and I kept breaking it and needed something to automatically fix it. Right? And he's like, I like this project, but honestly, my code was okay. It wasn't that great, and he wanted to collaborate on it, and he had contributed a lot of code to it for me. And I said, well, why don't you become a project administrator? But first, why are you doing this? And he says, well, these are real-world problems that he faces, and it wasn't just me. And it turned out after about a year of working on this project, we had several hundred people that were either participating in conversations or contributing code to the project so they can use it, and they're even presenting on it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I've got a lot of screen captures because I don't have my demo laptop up here. I apologize for that. However, afterwards, I'll be over at the Rubrik booth, and I'll try to connect to the Wi-Fi and show you anything you want, or if you just want to talk tech, that's cool. Right on? So let's talk about how to get started. And it really is easy, I promise you. It's not, there's no rocket science here. The first thing you need to do is go to GitHub. We're all familiar with GitHub. It's very searchable because if you look on GitHub, there's nothing called anything goofy like vSphere. It's kind of a weird name. And the actual genesis of this name was, can you guess where the V came from? VMware, vSphere, yeah. We stole the V from that because VMware has it in front of everything. And then the actual module that we use under the covers to do the testing and the remediation is called Pester. And an interesting thing about Pester was, have you noticed that Microsoft is embracing a lot more open source and Linux and things like that? I was at the PowerShell Summit recently, I think last year, earlier this year, whatever, and they admitted that it was one of the driving forces for Windows team to adopt open source. It was one of the first kind of community, open source, non-closed items that entered Windows. It's actually part of your native Windows 10 and beyond install, right? And it's there to do kind of like unit testing for PowerShell, right? So if you go there, you'll find it. This is what the project looks like. It's kind of confusing at first. Don't worry. Either download it manually, or you can use the PowerShell Gallery, which hopefully you're all familiar with because PowerCLI just transitioned to that recently with the 6.5. Whatever release of the code, right? So it's an install-module space vSphere, and you're good to go. If you do that through the gallery, the nice side effect is that all of the dependencies, such as the PowerCLI and other things, will automatically be installed for you, right? And if you don't prefer to do that, or if you have an offline install, feel free to just save the module information and copy it over to your environment. Cool so far? Just PowerShell, it's free, nothing going on there. The next step that you do is you use PowerCLI to connect to the vCenter environment of your choice. I'm curious how many people are actually using PowerCLI today, or at least aware of it? Pretty much everybody. So this should be familiar, right? Connect VI server. It's been the same command since it was the VI toolkit back in Luke's days up here, right? So you connect to the environment, you show that you're connected, everything's great. You then start off with a configuration. And originally when we wrote the software, there was no configuration creation device. So we added that because I'm willing to bet very few of you are making a brand new VMware environment on a daily basis. You probably have an existing one. So you'd run the new vSphere config command, and it's going to automatically use that connection that you have to vCenter, and it's going to build a JSON, which is just a JavaScript object notation file. It's just a text file, complete with all of the details on your environment. So the host, the switches, the distributed switches, the network, the virtual machines, vCenter, data centers, you name it, it's all there. There's a couple options you can use. I recommend for your first time, just run it with the quiet, and that'll automatically just take the defaults. It'll grab everything out of the environment that's possibly there and throw it into a config so you can see what happens. And then as you get more comfortable, you can remove the quiet, and we'll ask you a series of questions through the wizard. Right? So you can choose to go quiet to begin with, and then output folder will allow you to store that configuration file in a path of your choice. By default, we'll store it in the config folder in the module, but you can move that somewhere else. Cool so far? Pretty easy, right? Nothing crazy here. Once you have it there, you can go in and you can edit the config if you would like, because what we've done is we pulled all the values out of your vSphere environment and stored them for you. Therefore, if you were to run the vSphere software at this point, we shouldn't find too much deviation because we just pulled a snapshot of your environment. But if you would like, you can go into the config file. By default, it's called config.json, nothing fancy there. If you have Visual Studio Code or Notepad++, or I guess even regular Notepad if you're feeling cavalier, you can go in and edit the file. And if you don't put a location, that's where we put it automatically, the vSphere configs, config.json. So you're like, where did it go? That's where it went. Also, when we finish the command, we'll actually give you the path to where we store the config. And this is kind of what it looks like. It's just, again, JSON is just a format for a text file, and you can go in there and see the cluster, host, VM, et cetera configuration. So it's all in there. And you'll notice in this particular screenshot, I've got the DNS and NTP and other settings for the hosts is the part that I've kind of highlighted here. Cool so far? You're all going to use this like right after I get done with this, right? Cool. Editing the configuration, again, it's pretty easy. You can do it by hand. The neat thing is that you can make like choices on the fly. You can see what happens if you made a modification. You can make multiple configuration files. Maybe one for your prod environment, one for dev, one for playing around, one for reality. You can have as many as you want. And if you decide that you don't want vSphere to look at something in the environment, just remove the value. Right? There's no errors if we don't find a value. We just skip that and move on. So there's no need to kind of hold its hand, so to speak. It's a very simple file that you can work with. All right, so that's it for the configuration file. Again, it's just a text file. Everything beyond that is about validating that that configuration is reality. This is where we get to the declarative nature of the software. And this is where, over the past year, I'm extremely proud of the team. There's about 19 of us so far that are working on the code regularly. I'm probably the least active member in the community now. I just kind of look at the pull requests that come in from the different members and approve them and clap for everybody that's doing an amazing job. I just haven't had the time. But in reality, you're just going to do an invoke vSphere, and we abstract all of the complexity beyond that point. So I've got here invoke vSphere. You can then offer what tests you want to run. So I'm doing a get vSphere test, and I'm running the scope of cluster, meaning I only want to run vSphere against the cluster config. If you don't put that in there, it'll run against everything. And to be clear, by default, nothing changes. We're just going to look. We're going to validate that the configuration is true. And then I'm telling it specifically I want this config file. And this is what it looks like when an actual ISE IDE is running. I said, go ahead and run the test against my cluster configurations using this config file. That's what I'm expressing with the command. And it's going through and saying, all right, I'm going to look at your environment. I'm using the connection that you created to vCenter, and everything looks okay. It actually only ran one of the tests in there because the config file that I wrote only has one value for cluster, specifically the high availability state. So it came in and said, yep, your demo cluster, which is the only one that exists in your environment, it's good. It matches the state required. Therefore, one test passed, and everything else, there was no failures or anything like that. Cool so far? Just to reiterate, because this comes up a lot, nothing changes unless you tell it to change things, right? The execution of code to modify settings can't be invoked unless you put a parameter into the command called remediate, right? So it's not going to change, I swear. And the code is all open source, so you can prove it. You can look in there, you can delete the change part if you're really freaking out about it. It's designed to be very user-friendly. So with that said, let's break something, because I like doing that. So in this case, I want to break the DRS environment, and what I'm going to do is then rerun the test and show you what that looks like, right? So I'm going to take the demo cluster, which was kind of fun because it's a live environment used by hundreds of Rubrik engineers around the world, and I'm just breaking it so I can take a picture for this slide, which always felt good. And all I'm really doing is I'm changing it from a fully automated DRS to a partially automated DRS. So it's not horrible, right? You probably don't want to do that if your coworkers are watching or something like that, but hey, it's a demo lab, no big deal. So I made that change, and you can see the end result is that the demo cluster is now partially automated. Now this is actually something that I do semi-frequently when I don't want things moving around or I'm doing some maintenance, and typically this is done late night, right? So this could potentially happen. Now I want to rerun the test. But the weird thing was everything was back green. What's wrong? What did I forget to do? And I bring this up because it happens for some people. So it's like, wait, what'd I do? Well, I forgot I don't have a setting for DRS in the config, right? So by default, if we don't have a value to compare to, we won't, right? There's no actual test being run. So we need to add the DRS settings to the config. So that would be the first clue that, hey, I forgot to do something. So a little bit of like semi-live troubleshooting for the presentation. So all I have to do is go back to the cluster settings and add a DRS level value of fully automated. Now, how did I know that was there? Well, because if I go to the suite of tests and I do the git vSphere test, or if I get help on a particular test, we tell you what these values are. Also, if you were to run the vSphere config and we saw a value for DRS, we would put that in there for you automatically. So you can either ask the test, what are you looking for and what are the appropriate values for that test, and that way you know to put this in there, or when you're doing a new vSphere config, it'll automatically stick that in there for you. Now, as you can guess, if I'm telling it I want a fully automated cluster for all of my clusters, and I rerun the test, you get the red angry bleh on there. So it's saying, I want it to be fully automated, it wasn't. That's an issue, but I didn't tell it to fix it, right? So again, the command was just, I run vSphere, I want to run the cluster pieces of the test, here's the configuration, I've now edited the configuration to include DRS settings, and it's angry, Hulk smash for the DRS level, right? And there's some more details that you can get if you run it verbosely that will help you figure out what to do. Or just fix it. Just have vSphere do the troubleshooting for you. If you use -remediate, the parameter remediate, it's just a switch value, it'll automatically fix anything it finds wrong within the test. Now, to be clear, you have to be the administrator or someone with the authority to do that. You can't just be a user in someone else's cluster and vSphere magically fixes things. You'll get an error saying you don't have permissions to do that, right? But in this case, I am Lord of the demo, master of all, seer of everything. I've added the remediation to the step, and it's gone ahead and fixes it. And what actually happens is that when we see an issue and you have remediate turned on, we run the test again, right? So we run the test, it fails, we have a block of remediation code that will fix whatever that is based on that particular test, and then we rerun the test to make sure that it is fixed. If for some reason we didn't have permission or there was some reason that we couldn't make the change, the test will remain a failure, right? So it'll come back and say, could not do it. Pretty easy, right? Like -remediate, nothing really fancy there. What's actually happening under the covers is we've distilled all of the code to make it really simple to contribute. There's the actual value that we found, and then there's the fix for that value if you add remediate. Meaning, what did we actually find? We compare it to the config. If those don't match and you told us to fix it, we'll run the fix. Pretty straightforward, right? And before, it was a little bit complex. Every test was kind of custom and things like that. We've completely templatized all the tests so that all you have to do if you want to read a test or contribute to a test is understand how to get the value and what to do if we have the wrong value. That's it. Very, very simple pieces of code, right? So this is an example here where we've got this is an actual test piece of code. So we've got the title, something descriptive to make it easy for you. The description goes a little deeper so that if I run some help or I'm curious what the test does, that's what it does. What type of value we're looking for. In this case, it's a string because it's fully automated or partially automated, things like that. How do we actually get the value? So if we go to the config, we see the DRS automation value for that object. I'm sorry, not the config. If we go to the object that we pulled, it's that particular value. And then it's cut off a little bit, but the script block at the bottom is how we fix it. So it's pretty easy to see. It's one line. There's not a lot going on there. It looks way more complex than it is. The other thing we've done was a very helpful individual has gone through and wrote Getbook integration for the entire project. And so every time a test is added or altered or the help is edited in any kind of way, we publish it to our GitHub pages running on Getbook. So you have an interactive, full depth help for everything that we're running. This is an example from the GitHub page. If you just go to the vSphere project and click on documentation, it'll take you to that link. But it's wahlnetwork.github.io/vSphere, which is not the easiest thing to remember. And so for every command, we're actually running platypus, platyps, which is a thing that goes and finds all of the help for all of our PowerShell commands. It's going to go through and tell you, this is how we discover what the value is, and here's how we fix it. So we take all of the complexity and we reduce it down to really just 2 lines of code. And the reason for that was most all of these tests, pretty much all of them, come from you. They all come from the community. We had one person go through the hardening guide for vSphere 6.5 and 6.0 and things like that, and they wrote a test for all of that stuff, right? We had another person go in and they have EMC storage and things like that, and they wanted to add all of the tests for that, right? And those are all categorized and put in folders and things like that. And so we made this as simple as possible so that you can either add your own tests offline for your environment or contribute them back to the project. The next question I typically get is, that's great, but you're doing it manually. How do I automate this? How do I be the Waffle, right? And there's some pretty easy ways to do that. The way that I'm accomplishing it is I have a batch server running in my environment on Windows, and I'm just using Task Scheduler or the scheduled tasks. You could also use the PowerShell 6.0 implementation, which is running the new flavor of PowerShell core, and use the PowerCLI module for that, and Pester and things like that. And you could run cron jobs or Linux or Mac. I don't have either of those platforms. I don't know. I don't have a Mac. Would never touch one. I think it would burn my hands. Definitely a Microsoft dude. But you can go in there and you can set up scheduled tasks, because that's actually what I'm doing. I have multiple labs all over the world, including my own, that I do for work and personal. And I'm running vSphere every night based on where that lab is in the world. Sometimes it's 2 a.m. for me, sometimes it's 4 in the morning, sometimes it's in the afternoon, right? And that's easy. The other things you can do is automatically pass credentials with this encrypted XML file. You can put it directly in the scheduled task if you would like, whatever meets your security comfort, right? If it's a demo environment, you don't care, whatever. If it's your production environment, you probably want to harden the security for that. Cool so far, right? So in summary, let's wrap up. How can you contribute? Things like that. I already showed you where to download it, but it's vSphere on GitHub. If you work with the project and you're feeling a little brave, submit an issue, right? If you want something changed or added, or you feel there's a bug with the system, just go into the project. There's an issues button, and don't worry, it's not just for issues. It's also for ideas and bug fixes and enhancements. Create an issue. We have a template in there, and fill out the template with what you need. There you go. Submit their question or whatever, and someone will at least respond to it. We're all working in our spare time, weekends and nights, so it's not going to be, there's no SLA for how quick we'll get it in there. But there's a lot of discussion going on. We tend to tag things and have conversations with people. So definitely do that. If you're feeling really brave, submit some code, right? There's a template for that as well. If you go to pull in your code into the environment, you fill out the template, tell us what's going on, and then someone will review the code and either accept it or ask for some changes, and you're good to go, right? It's pretty straightforward. Also, that includes documentation. If you're new to GitHub and Git and editing these sorts of things, add some documentation. Did you know I'm a contributor to Docker? Because they misspelled VMware with a capital W, and I edited it to the lowercase w, and now I'm a contributor to Docker, right? There we go, thank you. I didn't need an applause for that, but I really hate the capital W. right? So you can be a contributor to basically any project you want. If you want something more interactive in real time, we have a Slack channel using very graciously hosted by the folks at VMware, their code program. So if you go to code.vmware.com/join, you can join VMware Code's Slack, and then specifically go to the vSphere channel, and you'll commonly see the Deadly Viper Assassination Squad TacoBot, which is how we integrate between Slack and GitHub. And TacoBot loves to tell people about what commits are going on and what issues are in there. And I think we've got about 50 people that are in the Slack channel, maybe more now. I don't track it as often as I should when I'm on the road, but you can go in there and have a conversation, ask questions, things like that. It is a no discrimination and no hate kind of environment. No question is off limits. No experience needed. So you can ask anything, no matter how, even if you think I'm the stupidest person in the world, they're all going to laugh at me. If anyone does that, they're banned. They're not allowed to do that. So it's a very open environment. Every question is accepted. So I don't want you to feel, it's not like IRC, where if you're not a 20-year veteran, you're going to have a bad day, right? So you're all welcome to come on there. If you feel like this session wasn't enough, we also did a session at VMWorld. I have the session ID there so you can search it on YouTube because the YouTube URL is ugly. So it's the VMTN6639U that Brian Bunky did. And honestly, he deserves a lot of credit for this project because over the past year or so, he's really shepherded pretty much all of the changes that have occurred with the code. He's a good dude, and I want to give him some attention because I think the work that he's doing on the project is very appreciated.